Hey there, welcome. I hope you're doing well. I'm Shawna, your counseling astrologer, and this is episode 4 of the Astro Psyche Podcast. Today we'll be talking about what is depth psychotherapy, and I'll be elaborating my thoughts on this, as well as incorporating an argument for why astrology is so relevant for depth psychotherapy and that it pairs so well. If you're new here, welcome. I'm so happy that you found me. And I hope to inspire you towards exploring depth psychotherapy as well as astrology. Please know that this episode may feel therapeutic, but it is not therapy. I am an astrologer and I am a marriage and family therapist trainee, but I am not a licensed therapist. With all of those disclosures out of the way, this topic was inspired by a question that I got from a friend recently who asked me why someone would be interested in depth psychotherapy when cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the norm, is usually covered under insurance. It's brief, it's quick, gets straight to the point. Why would someone be interested in a longer term therapy, depth psychotherapy? And so this really got me thinking about not just why someone would consider depth psychotherapy, why that would be more useful, but also what is, when we say depth psychotherapy, what is that? How do I define that? What is my understanding of that? And so I want to share that with you today and sort of like pull that apart. So what I'll start with is when this person asked me this question, I was reflecting on like, yeah, why? I have a podcast about depth psychological astrology. So I know that I'm in graduate school to become a depth psychotherapist. And so of course, like this is very important to me. But it also had me reflecting on why someone else may choose this. And that had me reflect on why I initially went into therapy myself years ago. And I think, so we'll pull this apart, but I think in essence, a person is drawn to depth psychotherapy because depth therapy provides healing when a person doesn't know really what the problem is. And that was sort of how I felt when I sought out therapy as an adult for the first time. There wasn't like a particular problem in my life. There was more just this feeling of something being not quite right. And I had tried all these different ways of trying to, improve my relationships, to improve my well-being, my emotional well-being. And I was getting to a point where I wasn't feeling better. And in fact, I was starting to feel worse. And again, it was like nothing external that I could point to. It was just kind of like this feeling. And I think that is what depth psychotherapy helps with. And I think that people are drawn to that, especially when there's kind of an existential suffering, and or the problem is more relational, and the problem is more, I say problem sort of like in air quotes, the challenge is more related to interpersonal dynamics, or it's related to the structure of their personality. And so there's not really one specific thing that we can point to and say, okay, we just need to change this. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is really great when there's one tiny specific problem that can be targeted and worked on. But I find that human life is complicated. We are complicated and complex, and suffering is a part of our life as humans. So I think that while CBT can be a helpful quick fix for some people, depth psychotherapy is really where it's at as far as sustainable and deep change and transformation and healing. So I want to read to you. So those are sort of my base thoughts that came up when I was reflecting on my experience. And I want to share with you what I shared with this person that sort of I feel is like a good encapsulation of what depth psychotherapy is. So I said, why use depth psychotherapy instead of CBT therapy? I said CBT is helpful when the problem is easily identifiable, specific, and limited to one issue or area of life. For example, a fear of suffocation or a fear of being out in public spaces or something like this. CBT theory works under the assumption that we can control our behavior with our conscious mind and thought process. So this is really big, is that CBT is oriented around our conscious mind and our will to change. CBT does acknowledge that we have unconscious thought patterns we have unconscious patterning that's going on that creates our challenge, but it really relies on our conscious mind to decide to change. In contrast, depth psychotherapy is helpful when the problems are relational or they feel outside of our conscious control. It works, depth psychotherapy works with the personality structure and unconscious patterns that correlate to the presenting problem. The therapist serves as a container and object to work out past issues in a new way. For example, a person who always finds themselves in the same problematic relationship dynamic may come in for depth psychotherapy to explore and repattern their attachment dynamics. For example, maybe that person always falls in love with a critical or abusive or addicted romantic partner. Or maybe they're plagued with feelings of existential meaninglessness that they can't shake despite having a highly successful career. In these kinds of cases, it's not clear why the problem exists, and the person may feel caught in the problem no matter how much they work with their thoughts and try to make better decisions. In these cases, the person experiences that it's not possible to solve their problem through a conscious thought process. Along these same lines, some people may find CBT helpful for certain issues and then seek depth psychotherapy if their problem persists. So that was sort of, I realize that's a lot, but that was sort of my, in a nutshell, answer. And I want to go even deeper into this to explore why and how depth psychotherapy works. But I want to emphasize the distinction between working with the conscious mind with CBT versus depth therapy is really about working with the unconscious and repatterning attachment styles, repatterning your relational patterns. And there's an emphasis on understanding what happened earlier in your life to create the person that you are now. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to talk about all of that specifically. Sometimes that's helpful, but I find that simply the attunement, and I'll talk more about attunement in a moment, the experience of attunement with the therapist, that is where the healing happens. So I hope that makes sense. So Pacifica Graduate Institute, where I'm receiving my training to become a depth therapist, defines depth psychotherapy or depth psychology as psychologies that orient themselves around the idea of the unconscious. So this can be there's several different styles, just like anything, it's like, we're like, okay, depth psychotherapy, but there's a lot of there's a lot of different traditions and methods within that chunk. So what are those? So there's psychoanalytic, psychodynamic. Those styles really focus on the attachment repatterning, working with relationships, and working with gaining insight into the unconscious dynamics that are happening. And sometimes this is enacted in the therapy room. Sometimes it's more about talking through it. But oftentimes the dynamic is brought to light through working with the therapist. There's also Jungian analysis. Jungian analysis, I'm finding, is really more about interpreting. And that may or may not be for some people. I find it to be sometimes when we interpret too much, it doesn't facilitate the healing process. But Jungian definitely works with the unconscious and has more of like a spiritual bent versus psychoanalytic or psychodynamic. There's also relational psychodynamic therapy, which is really based on that attunement and the relationship between the client and the therapist. And then there's sand play therapy, which is where there's literally a tray of sand, and you might want to Google this or YouTube it. It's really interesting to watch. So there's a tray of sand that the therapist has, and then they have all of these figurines, and then the client will create a like a scene in the sand using the different figurines. And with sand play therapy, that is typically no interpretation. It's creating the tray. And then if you want to, you can talk about it, but you don't have to. The emphasis is more on the nonverbal processing. And I think this is, and so I'm emphasizing that it's less talking and more just doing. We could also say that expressive art therapy is this way too, when there's no analyzing of it, like, oh, this, this figure and this figure means this. It's like, no, in sand play, there's none of that. And I think that's so important because that process is a nonverbal healing phenomenon. And so psyche doesn't necessarily need us to talk about a problem in order for it to be processed and transmuted and healed. There's something that can happen energetically when you process something through action or through symbolic means. In this case, it would be placing figures in the tray in a way that you're inspired to. It could be creating a piece of art or something like that. So my point is that all of these different models and styles of depth psychotherapy are oriented around working with the unconscious through things like dreams or art or synchronicity, or using the symptom or the behavior as like symbolizing that. But they can all be very different and they can all feel very different. And so I think it's really important to, if you're seeking out depth psychotherapy or if you're interested in it, to sort of like explore all the different styles and to know that that they're going to feel very different, and to notice if there's one in particular that you're more drawn toward. So it's so interesting because when I initially started my my graduate degree, I was very into Jungian analysis and Jungian therapy because in astrology, there's a strong connection between Carl Jung and astrology. And so I was really into that. But the more that I've studied, I've actually become more interested in relational psychodynamic therapy. because Jungian therapy is more about interpreting things, which I think can be helpful, but I'm finding that I get more from a therapeutic approach that is highly relational. So that actually is a good segue into some of the core components of depth psychotherapy, and one of those is attunement. So attunement is a phenomenon that is deeply healing for us. And I want to read a quote to you on attunement. So the way that I look at attunement is it is being with a person very deeply without trying to change them or to do anything to alleviate their suffering. It's just like being there with them and accompanying them in their current state. And that sounds really simple, but it's really fucking hard to do. And you've probably experienced this if you've been around someone who's sad or mad or upset or grieving. And your instinct is probably going to be to comfort them, to make them feel better. And there is nothing wrong with that. That is a natural instinct, and it's something that we do. And in a therapeutic sense, the healing comes when we are with a person exactly where they are without trying to make them feel better. So I'm going to quote from a book called Essential Psychodynamic Psychotherapy, an Acquired Art. It's by Teri Quatman. So this is page 12. She says, attuned listening takes place outside the medium of words. It is centered around the wordless communication of an emotion or a need state or a state of being from one person to another, often underneath and even apart from language they're using. So what she means by this, often apart from language they're using, it means in depth therapy, we're paying attention to the words that a person is using, which is the content, but we're also paying attention to the process, the way in which they're saying it. And we're picking up not just nonverbal cues, but we're also tuning in, the therapist is also tuning into their own feeling state and their own physical sensations, their intuition, and sort of like feeling into what's happening with this person. Now, there's a reason that this book is called Psychodynamic Psychotherapy, an Acquired Art, because it is very, it's difficult to do, to like listen to what someone's saying and then to feel into it and tune into it and to separate out what may be the therapist's own personal stuff versus the client stuff. So it is something that is very subtle, and that's why people get training for this kind of thing. So I want to go on to quote here in another section, page 13. She says, even mature therapists at times use doing something as a way to stave off the anxiety and often the helplessness of merely listening to the other, merely being with. And I love this so much because I think that not just in therapy, but in our daily life or any healing profession, I think that we severely undervalue the process of simply being with a person, simply accompanying them and sitting with them so that they are not alone in their suffering or even in their experience. And I know for myself, doing And whether that's like staying busy or trying to fix something or someone, that's definitely something that I notice in myself, where if I'm feeling some level of discomfort or anxiousness about something, I'll try to fix it or I'll try to do something with it versus sitting with it. When sitting with it is usually more productive. It's so ironic. Yeah, so this attunement. So that's a core part of depth psychotherapy, is this attunement piece, this piece of not fixing the problem. And within the space of not fixing the problem, being with the person, that is where deep and sustainable change and transformation happens. Now, it takes a long time, usually. I mean, not always, but it's usually like it's a process. It's a journey. As compared to CBT therapy, it is really more about fixing. You target the problem, you attack it, you get in there and you fix it, and then you're done. From my perspective, the reason why CBT doesn't always work for people is because sometimes the problem that we see, the symptom, the presenting problem, is not always, but it can be connected to an unconscious pattern that is deeper. And then that unconscious pattern is just going to pop up in another way. And so depth psychotherapy goes deep into the roots of your psyche to say, okay, like what's going on here? What is not sustainable, or what is it that really doesn't work for you in the way that you've matured and grown? And it helps to create growth-inducing experiences from a deeply rooted level. Now, that's not for everyone, of course, but I find it very compelling. And so that's actually a segue into another part here that I wanted to share, is that depth psychotherapy tends to have a more spiritual or relational emphasis. Not always, but often. And I think this is because it's so difficult to go deeply into your psyche and to not find a sense of awe and wonder of your connection to the world and your connection to life, and to feel a connection to something greater than yourself. I think it's very difficult to go down in there and to not find that and to not have that feeling. So along with that, psyche in Greek actually means soul. So psychology literally means the study of soul. And I just find that like perfect. So the way that psyche, the way that soul communicates to us is through symbolic means. So this is why when we're doing depth psychotherapy, many depth psychotherapists will work with symbolic techniques, such as interpreting your dreams, or interpreting even daydreams or fantasies, symbolically interpreting your presenting problem or your symptom, looking at synchronicities as a symbolic communication of psyche, looking at art and even speech patterns, even like the way that you dress can be an expression of your psyche. And so this symbolic view of life is also a core component of depth psychotherapy. So in depth psychotherapy, everything is a symbol of psyche. Everything can be symbolic. And what starts to happen is, that's really cool, is when we look at life this way, we start to see patterns. We start to see sort of like clusters of patterns that come together. And this pattern spotting is like, it's when psyche is speaking to you. So what do I mean by this, like cluster of patterns? I mean, when you repeatedly get the same feedback on a certain situation, when maybe 2 or 3 people say the same thing to you over and over again, and it like strikes you, or maybe you notice yourself getting into very similar relationship dynamics, that is a symbolic way of psyche speaking to you. And it's not, there's not a value judgment on it. It's not like it's good or it's bad or it was meant to be. It can definitely be like pleasing or unpleasing, and you can be like, oh, I like this or I don't like this. But the symbolic pattern is psyche expressing itself to you and through you. And so this is what's so cool about astrology, is that this is what astrology does. Astrology organizes, it organizes us into a symbolic pattern through the birth chart. And so in the birth chart, we have all of these symbols, and the symbols mean different things, and then layers upon layers upon layers of the different symbols, planets and aspects and houses, and transits. When we lay them together, we start to see patterns, and we start to see patterns that align with one another and emphasize one another. We start to see patterns that conflict with one another or are contrary and try to balance each other out or cancel each other out. And we see like this this vibrant expression of your life, your psyche, and how you are. And so this is a way of working with someone that really emphasizes viewing the symbolic of life, viewing, we could say, the spiritual in life. And I think that applies, for me, that applies. But I think it's less about spiritual, and it's less about depth psychology being spiritual, and it's more about depth psychotherapy orienting itself around the unconscious and knowing that the unconscious speaks in symbols, that psyche speaks in symbols. And when we look at life this way, we can start to tap into that. We can start to tap into the unconscious and to communicate with it and to play with it. So I hope you found this interesting. To summarize, what we talked about today is what is depth psychotherapy? I feel I may have answered that, but I may also have brought up more questions for you than answers, which pleases me, because I think this is a very, like its name, it's a very deep and rich topic. So what we talked about today is that depth psychotherapy or depth psychology is any psychology that orients itself around the idea of the unconscious informing our behavior and informing our presenting problem. There's lots of different styles and approaches and techniques, but they all orient around working with the unconscious. And that 2 core components of this are attunement, that attunement is a healing process. And secondly, that having a symbolic view of life is essential in working with depth psychology and working with those principles. Now, I will say that this is not for everyone. And some people have no interest. Some people are not into it. They don't want to talk to their unconscious, and that's totally cool. That's fine. I think there is something for everyone. And if you find this interesting, if you feel called towards it, drawn towards it, I think there is something here for you. And I think that there are so many people that are hungry for this depth of experience. So I will leave you with that. Please, I would love it if you leave a review or a comment on this podcast or wherever you're listening to, and share it with a friend. I'm hoping to get these messages out to as many people as possible who would find it interesting. I am wishing you so much love and a wonderful day. I'll talk to you later. Bye.